Hi, Professor Lightby here, today to talk about social influence. So social influence, basically the ways that people are affected by the presence of others, real or imagined, um, includes such domains as conformity, compliance, obedience, and we'll talk about all three of those forms of social influence. So we'll answer the question, what leads people to yield to or resist the influence of other people? So a lot of social influence is automatic, and we've seen this in the course in much of our discussion of social perception uh, and factors contributing um, to behavior of people simply in response to the presence of others or what others are doing. We've seen much of this throughout the course. Social influence basically is in many ways automatic. We're vulnerable to basically reflex like influences, okay? Automatic kinds of responses, okay? Just like animals exhibit rudimentary forms of automatic imitation, okay? Uh, and we'll talk more about this in the next narration, which we'll talk about compliance processes and how we kind of are automatically triggered by our situations. In the meantime, let's talk very briefly about one form of automatic influence that is highly unconscious but very common. That is mimicry. Okay, so mimicry um, is when we basically uh, uh, unconsciously and automatically kind of imitate or behave in ways that mimic, okay, what others are doing with their body, with their speech and things like that. Mimicry enables people to interact and communicate smoothly because it influences behaviors, it influences emotions, even language and speech styles. Okay, so what do we mean by mimicry? Okay. Well, here's a good example of a piece of research that was done uh, to look at how we mimic or imitate in a conversation. Okay, what others, what the person we're talking to or the person we're interacting with is doing. Okay, so in this study. Participants in the study basically interacted in a conversation with another person who happened to be a Confederate. Okay, an accomplice of the experimenter who was instructed to, in various at various times, who had been basically trained to either rub her face, okay, uh, or shake her foot, okay. Uh, and so at these intervals during which the Confederate was engaging in these kinds of behaviors, okay, um, the experimenters were recording, okay, how often the participant basically did the same thing, okay, and so the results are very interesting. If we look at the uh, times in which um, the Confederate was rubbing her face, okay, we see that during those times, okay, the participant was more likely to rub her face, okay, than to shake her foot, okay. But during the time intervals in which the Confederate had shook her foot, okay, we can see that the participant was more likely to be shaking uh, um, her foot than rubbing her face. Okay, so we see the clear impact, okay, of what the participant does, the clear impact of what the Confederate is doing on the unconscious behavior, these kind of automatic reactions of uh, of the Confederate. We see that when the Confederate rubs face, the participant is more likely to. When the Confederate shakes foot, the participant is more likely to do so. So that's mimicry. Okay, it's an automatic thing that we all do. We basically adapt our behavior, sometimes even our speech. Okay, in terms of whether we have a tint of the accent that the person we're speaking to is giving has. Okay, um, so. So mimicry is a very common kind of reaction that we have, and it's really a form of social influence, unconscious, subtle social influence on behavior. Okay, so this brings us to the idea of mindlessness. Okay, so mimicry occurs without thought. Okay, and other behaviors do as well, including responses to verbal kinds of information. And we tend to follow the script that is sort of prompted by sometimes situational cues. Okay, and a good way to present this is to show you a video uh, having to do with, it's called the photocopier request study, a summary of this. So I'm going to show that here, and if it somehow doesn't get through to you, it's in the video theater.
Reaching sexual exhaustion, limiting your body's ability to utilize the testosterone in your body. Basically, Jack.
Imagine you are standing in the checkout queue in the supermarket, or you are standing in a queue for the copy machine because you need to make copies, and you are really in a rush because you have a lot of other things to do, and therefore you are thinking of ways how to jump the queue. Maybe, if there's only one person in front of you, you just say, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the copy machine?" And chances are that your success rate is at about 60%. About 60% of the people would say, okay, you can pass. That's at least the percentage they found when they tested this scenario in a classical study in 1978, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. 60% success rate just for asking and not giving any reason is really not bad. But what happens if you give a reason? So in another condition, they said, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the copy machine because I'm in a rush?" So quite a plausible reason, and the success rate for this group was already much higher. The success rate was 94%. 94% of the participants said, okay, yeah, you can pass. So the first thing we learn, if you want to jump the queue, give a good reason. I confess, this is not too surprising, but what we learn from another experimental condition is absolutely surprising, because they could show that it is not necessary to give a good and plausible reason, but it looks like that you can give almost every nonsense reason. Because in the last condition, the participants were asked, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the copy machine because I have to make copies?" What? He wants to use the copy machine before me because he wants to make copies? Come on, I want to make copies as well. But that's no reason to make the copies first. Yeah? So this is not plausible, this is nonsense. Nevertheless, the success rate for this question was almost the same as for the question with the plausible reason, It was 93%. So almost everybody agreed, almost everybody said, yeah, okay, you can pass. So what's going on here? Well, the reason why giving a pseudo reason to improve compliance rates for small requests, making 5 copies is a really small request, and they could show that the pseudo reason was no longer effective when it was about making 20 copies. So as long as the request was small, a pseudo reason was sufficient, but when it would take a serious amount of time, when the costs might be quite high, then the pseudo reason, the nonsense reason, did no longer work. So one could guess that it only works if we are mindless, if we don't think about it too hard, because then we rely on automated scripts, we rely on what we experienced in the past, and we experience that whenever anybody tells us, well, could I please blah blah blah, because blah blah blah, usually the other person presents a plausible reason. And as our brain is sometimes a little bit lazy, it relies on these past experiences and it says, well, yeah, whatever. But when it's a huge request, our brain begins to listen carefully and wants to hear a good and real reason. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want, we'll see you again next time.
Okay. All right. So basically, that is an example, a classic example of mindless responses to a situational cue. So the percentage of people who complied with the request by the person to jump the line, okay, came to them, went from like 60% to 93%, okay, when the person asking, okay, used the word because. It was a completely meaningless because, may I cut in line to use the copy machine because I need to make copies, okay? So that's not really a reason, okay? It just restates the person's need, okay? But nevertheless, we see all this compliance with the request going way, way up, okay? And there's a magic word there, and the video basically tells us what that was, okay, which is the word because. Whoops. So we're not really thinking about it, we're wherever and so on and so forth, but we've learned that because implies a reason. So all we needed to do is, if we were waiting in line and the person made the request, is hear the word because, okay? Because kind of triggers this kind of automatic response. Oh, okay, the person has a reason, you let him in, okay? We're not really hearing anything except mainly this because, okay? Unless it's a more important situation, such as the person wants to cut in line to make a lot of copies, okay? But if it's just a few, okay, we get this compliance being increased solely by the presence of the magic word because. Okay, that's mindlessness, okay? And there's lots of ways in which Ellen Langer, a social psychologist, has done a lot of research on the phenomenon of mindlessness. So, for example, she did research in which she showed how basically, we'll see more of these examples later, but a classic example that she gave was the situation where this candle store, okay, was having a real difficult time with the sales and needed to perk them up. And so they decided to, so they used some signs in front of the door, and that didn't seem to help much. Till they came up with the sign, candles that burn, okay, come in and get one, okay. That actually increased, okay, sales, okay, and people coming into the store, even though when you think about it, it's completely mindless. Well, that's what candles do. They burn. Okay, what kind of candle would it be if it didn't burn? But nevertheless, this kind of mindless response, oh, this, basically led to this increase in compliance with the request to buy something. So there are various cues out there that are going to trigger kind of automatic compliance responses, unless it's an important kind of thing. Because most of the time, kind of trivial, not very important things, we're kind of running on automatic, as we've seen often in the class, and so we respond in these automatic ways. All right, let's turn attention now to what's on the screen now, which is conformity. Okay, so conformity refers to the tendency to change our perceptions, our opinions, our behaviors in ways that are consistent with group norms. Okay. Are you a conformist or a nonconformist? Well, we all conform. Okay. We can ask the question, when was the last time you actually was actively nonconformed, did not conform to a social norm? And if you think about it, well, it doesn't happen too often. So we're all conformists to an extent. Some of us conform more than others. Most people in North America often identify themselves as nonconformists. And you might ask yourself, why might this happen? Okay. Well, it happens because for some reason the idea of being a conformist, okay, it has bad connotations. Okay, it implies a person is weak-willed. They don't have they don't think independently, and so on. Okay, and indeed, some forms of conformity are so extreme and so kind of blatant we frown upon them. Okay, so nonconformist conformity has kind of a bad connotation. Okay, but as we're going to see, conformity is basically a common common behavior in human society, and it would be difficult to imagine a world in which there wasn't conformity. Okay, people didn't conform to rules, they didn't conform to norms. That would not be a very tenable situation for any society. But let's look at research on conformity. So there are early classic studies basically demonstrating conformity, okay, that sort of set the stage to kind of understand the basics of conformity, okay. You have Sharif's studies that were done way back in the 1930s, who studied how norms develop, okay, and people then sort of conform to these norms in small groups, okay. And we're going to look at that research because he used something known as the autokinetic effect to test this the phenomenon of norm development, okay, and then we'll look at the very famous studies by Solomon Asch, okay, on how people's beliefs affect the beliefs of others, okay, and how people's behavior, okay, is influenced by just what people say they believe, okay, is affected by what others say they believe, okay. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But let's look at Sharif first. So Sharif did this research, or this ingenious research, where he used a stimulus which basically is known as the autokinetic effect. Okay, so if you're in a completely dark room and there's a beam of light, okay, in front of you, at some distance in front of you, it will appear to basically shift, to move. Okay, so there's no real change happening, but there is the impression, okay, that of change, okay, of movement, okay. So it's autokinetic effect comes in. It's the it's not really moving, okay, but we automatically see kinetic. We see movement, okay. So if you ask people, put people in a dark room and present present the light, okay, this little dot of light, okay. You can then ask people, okay, you see the light, how far did it move, okay, and how many inches do you think it moved, okay. You're going to get quite a variety, okay. The people experience the illusion. They all experience the illusion. We all experience the illusion, but the extent to which we evaluate it or judge how much it moved varies dramatically from person to person. Again, there's no real movement, okay? It's an illusion, okay? So Sharif had people in the dark room, presents the light, okay, and asks people to estimate, okay, and they do this individually. They're all in the room by themselves. They go through numerous trials where a light's presented. How far did it move? And in this one example, we'll talk about 3 hypothetical participants. You see variety, okay, in how much they perceive the light to have moved, okay. Participant A sees that it jumped 8 inches, and then participant B and participant C 2 and 1 inches respectively, okay. Now they're brought in together, okay, and we're going to continue this, and we'd like you to give your responses. Okay, so people in the room together. Participant A gives his estimate. Participant B gives his estimate. Participant C also gives an estimate, okay, through numerous trials. And as trials move on, okay, so they've gone through a group session, okay, where they're hearing others' responses and they're given their own, okay. Now they're again brought back and tested individually, okay. And so now people are given their responses individually, okay. Again, after going through the group session, okay, and their individual responses are somehow magically closer together, okay. Not so magically, it's suggestibility, okay. They go through another session where they do it together. They're tested individually, and they're yet a little bit closer, okay. A third session, and then they're tested individually, and we see that their responses are virtually identical, even though they're being tested individually, okay. So we see this convergence of perception, okay, convergence of judgment, okay, based on simply hearing the estimates of other people. Okay, again, it's a very subjective thing. And Sharif and others have talked about this as the development of a group norm. Okay, so you're hearing what others' responses are. They're all over the place, but they sort of converge. Okay, the norm you develop, that you respond to, basically converges toward the average of those, okay. And so through time, people came into agreement with one another simply by hearing what others were saying, the judgments given by others. So they were suggestible, okay. And hence we have this form of social influence, okay, kind of a form of conformity, okay. You change simply by hearing, okay, what the responses given by others. Okay, so that's suggestibility, okay. Now, what about Asch, okay? Well, Solomon Asch's studies, and many people have heard about these studies, okay, basically involve, a task that you're going to see in this video that I'm going to show right now.
The Asch experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1.
2.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3.
3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. 1. 1. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1. 1.
Okay, so that is a demonstration of the Asch conformity experiment. Basically, here is the paradigm, in case you guys sort of missed it. So basically, we got a participant, and that was a simulation, okay, I believe, but it certainly wasn't the original experiments, which basically were. Well, let me describe them a little bit more fully. So there's a repeated series of these tasks where a standard line is presented, comparison lines, and participants going from one side of the table to the next, left to right, if you will, okay, give their responses, okay. And normally, well, in the original experiments and in many kinds of settings, there are a total of 6 people responding, okay. And 5 of them are Confederates who have been kind of pre-programmed to give the right answer, to give a certain answer, right or wrong, okay. That the first 4, and then the participant is in position 5, okay. And then there's another Confederate afterward, okay, who basically goes along with the group, whatever the answer is, okay. That's after the participant response. Now there's normally like 40 trials, okay, in the Asch study, okay. And on most of the trials, everybody, all the Confederates, they give the right answer, okay. But among the 40 trials, 10 of them are conformity trials, where every one of the Confederates, 1 through 4, okay, give the wrong answer. So they might say, as you saw in the video, a C, okay, when the right answer clear is B, okay. And of course, the dependent measure here has to do with how the participant will respond, okay. How many times in these 10 trials did the person the real subject go with his senses, okay, or go with what the minority, what the majority, what all the others said, which was the incorrect answer, C. So let's look at the kind of results that were found in terms of about those 10 conformity trials in the experiment. What was the rate at which conformity occurred? So as it turns out, participants went along with the unambiguously incorrect majority 37% of the time. That means on close to 4 out of 10 conformity trials, the average participant conformed. Okay, and again, it's a clearly incorrect answer. That was a surprising and shocking amount of conformity to a majority that is clearly wrong. Okay. Now, 25% of the participants never conformed at all. They went through the experiment without ever conforming to the majority response of the Confederates when it was wrong. But that means 3/4 of the participants conformed at least one time. Okay, 50% conformed for at least half of the critical conformity trials. So that's a lot of conformity on a perceptual test that is clearly in which the majority is clearly given the wrong response. Okay. So why did that happen? Okay. Well, we can look at why people conform. Okay. So in social psychology and in other social sciences, we often talk about two different kinds of influence, okay, or two different bases of influence, okay. One is normative influence. People conform because they fear the consequences of appearing deviant. That's based on, the basic need for acceptance, the need to avoid social rejection, okay, the primitive human need to belong, okay, which manifests itself, okay, in our need to be accepted by others, okay, to avoid social rejection and, if you will, being booted from the group, okay. And we learn this very early in life. We all know, and throughout life, what it means, what happens when we're rejected by the group, okay. When we experience social rejection, it's a painful thing. It has all kinds of negative consequences. And one of the things we learn, it flies in the face of our need to belong, okay. So we all know the punishment associated with rejection, the rewards of acceptance, okay, and that's kind of built into us. So we conform because we fear the consequences of appearing deviant, okay. Now there's another form of influence, basis of influence, which we call informational influence. We conform because we believe others are correct in their judgments, okay. So this is based on the need to be correct, another basic human need to perceive that we have control or understanding. Remember the basic human needs that we had talked about very early in the course and have revisited many times. Well, here's two of them: the need to belong and the need to understand and control and feel that you're in control of what's going on around you. Okay, so these are the bases for lots of social influence, including conformity. Okay, and we can look at some evidence for each of these bases. Okay, each of these basis of influence, okay, from Asch type studies, okay. So, for example, if we look at normative influence, it's known that what's really important in the Asch or Asch-like kind of situation, okay, is unanimity of the majority, okay. That is, these individuals who are giving the wrong answer, okay, they all have to be in agreement with their wrong answer, okay. If there's one person who deviates before the real subject from the majority's response, incorrect response, then we see conformity dropping precipitously, okay. It drops from that 37% level to about 6% when, for example, among the four individuals giving the Confederates giving the wrong answer, one of them gives the right answer, or just gives simply a different answer. Okay, it's kind of like deviates. Okay, that happens before we get to the real subject. The conformity to that majority, still 3 people giving the wrong answer. Okay, drops precipitously. So that would be normative influence. If you've got an ally, if there's some a level of social support for your answer, okay, which if you give the right one is going to be deviant, okay, then you go with your perception and you don't conform to the group. We talked about the impact of a deviant having having an ally in dissent, if you will. Okay, so there has to be unanimity. Okay, so if you got anybody kind of like giving any kind of non-conforming or a different answer, you're going to get it. And if there is in fact one specific deviant, okay, that's going to reduce conformity dramatically. Okay, cohesiveness effects. So we're going to talk more about cohesiveness, which is the idea later in the course when we talk about groups. Cohesiveness has to do with the extent to which people value their membership in a group. Okay, the extent to which the group is attractive to the individual. Okay? Cohesive groups, people want to be in the group. Okay, they value their membership in the group. Well, as it turns out, often the greater the cohesiveness, okay, the greater the conformity. Okay, so if the groups are bonded together in some specific way, and you are drawn to you're attracted to being and staying in this group, okay, you're going to be even more likely to conform. Okay, why? Because in terms of normative influence, it's the need for acceptance and to avoid rejection is much greater. Okay, when there is when the group is cohesive, when people value their membership in the group. Publicity. Okay, so in the ASH studies, we'll see this a little bit more. Talk about this just a little bit more in a moment. Okay, when notice that in the ASH main studies, okay, the responses are given publicly. Okay, that the real subject has to express his response publicly. Okay, what happens when he is allowed to respond privately? Okay, well, conformity goes down pretty dramatically. Okay, and why? Because of normative influence. Okay, you're not risking the disapproval of the group. Okay, by publicly stating in front of the group a response that contradicts the group. Okay, so publicity is absolutely important. The greater the publicity, the more likely there's going to be conformity. Okay, and if we look at informational influence, okay, well, expertise. So the ASH conformity situation has been expanded and tried in many different kinds of situations. Okay, different kinds of stimuli, and sometimes the stimuli are such that people may differ. Okay, so a little bit of an interruption there. Let me proceed. Some of the paradigms that have been used have used tasks that one could be that conceivably be an expert on. Okay, so if for example people are making judgments about for example fashions. Okay, and women tend to be more expert at this kind of thing, and so the judgment task has to do with judging the quality, whether it's a good fashion, giving it a rating. Okay, oh yeah, I like that jacket, I like that. So 7-point scale, you're giving it a 6. And so what you tend to find, okay, is that when it comes to judgments like that, so in some trials, the individual gives you know, an obviously wrong kind of response, that it's just it's a god awful ugly thing, but the group is rating it really really highly. Okay, you find that men, for example, are more likely to conform than women. Okay, because they don't see themselves as much as experts. Okay, on the other hand, if it's like a football strategy, okay, then women are more likely to conform than men because that's kind of a male thing. Males feel are perceived as more expert at it. Women then conform more so than men on those kinds of tasks. So expertise plays into this. Okay, we're more likely to conform to an expert. Okay. Well, that's informational influence, okay? Because if we feel we don't have the information as much, and the other person has the group has a lot of expertise, we're more likely to conform because we can use that information. Okay? When tasks are ambiguous, okay? So when tasks are ambiguous, okay, so the ash was not an ambiguous task, right? I mean, it was clear the lines were, the length of the lines was pretty obvious, okay? But you can make the task more ambiguous, like having people do a dot estimation task where they're presented with a bunch of with a computer screen with all kinds of dots on it, and you're looking at the and the response is estimate the number of dots. Okay, it's a very ambiguous task. Okay, and you get a lot more conformity on ambiguous tasks like that because people need information. It's not cut and dry. So what others are saying is going to influence your response more readily. That's informational influence. Okay. People's confidence. Okay, so there's with these dot estimate. Well, we see confidence involved with the male versus female example that we gave, where expertise is also involved. But when you make so if the to take an example from like this dot estimation example, so people can basically in a study can be given a pretest and they can kind of learn, they can be told, oh, you're really good at this, okay? You're right on the mark, you're really within just a few dots of being correct, completely correct, okay? Or people can be told, hey, you're not so good at this at all, you just don't seem to do well on this task, okay? But let's move on. And now you're doing dot estimation tasks after hearing the responses of Confederates, okay, who have been basically programmed to give, wildly incorrect answers, or a more reasonable answer. And you find that when people who are made confident of their judgments, they ignore more readily the expert. Okay, I'm sorry, they ignore more readily the majority. Okay, who's giving the wrong answer. Okay, stick with their own judgments. But if their confidence has been shaken in the task, they become more subject to conformity, more likely to conform to the incorrect or off base majority. Okay, and that's informational influence, because if you're not confident, that means you have a greater need for the information of others, and so you conform for that reason. Okay, so we can see the workings of normative and informational influence in the ASH-like kinds of conformity tests. Okay, these are very, very important concept that you get down, because we're going to see it a lot as we proceed. Normative and informational influence. So get those definitions in your head. Now, two types of conformity. Okay, we can talk about private conformity, the change of beliefs that occurs when a person privately accepts the position taken by others. Okay, so there's actual change in the person, if you will, in the person's beliefs. True acceptance. Public conformity is a superficial change in behavior without any change of opinion. It's produced by real or imagined group pressure, as we've seen in ASH, but it's purely public, and there's not really any much change in the person. Okay, so how do we tell the difference? Okay, well, in both cases, if it's public or private conformity, the observable behavior is the same. But does the person still do the behavior when the others are gone? Okay. Well, in Sharif's research, when people are retested alone, remember that the tests are there after the group session, they're tested alone. They still gave estimates that reflected the norm that had developed in the group responses. But in ASH's studies, when they wrote their answers down or gave their answers privately, conformity dropped sharply. So we're seeing true change in the Sharif kind of situation, and really public conformity only in the ASH study. Okay, that's how we tell the difference. Okay, does the person still do the behavior when the others are gone? But I should note, even public conformity can give rise to real change. Okay, because people may begin to, why is that group, why are they given this different answer than what seems to me to be the correct answer? Am I looking at this the wrong way? Well, you might redefine the stimulus. Okay, you might reconsider the stimulus, and if it's ambiguous enough, okay, you may actually change in your perception of the stimulus, even if it is public conformity. Okay. And we also have the role of public conformity, as we saw with dissonance, okay, that if you basically say something that contradicts your attitude, okay, if the conformity situation is subtle enough, you may have to reduce your dissonance now between what you said and what your lion eyes tell you, if you will. You may have to change your opinion. There's going to be pressure to kind of think about things a little bit differently and redefine the stimulus more in a way more consistent with what the group that you're conforming to is saying. Okay, so you can get real change out of public conformity situations because of these processes involving how attributions, dissonance reduction, okay, discomfort with seeing something or believing something in one way, even though others are seeing it differently. Okay, so the line between public and private, or the effects on behavior, okay, it's a little blurry, but basically that's how we tell the difference between public and private conformity. Okay. So, final thing to talk about in this narration is to look at a very interesting kind of idea, which is, and we saw this with the photocopier request study. Remember that the more important the request was, the less likely people were to mindlessly comply with it. Okay, so importance, okay, seems to play a role there. Does it play a role in conformity? Okay, now the general idea is to think, well, the more important something is to me, the less likely I am to conform. Okay, to just take what others are saying and conform with it. Okay, conform to it. And in many cases that's true, but it's not so simple. Okay, it has to do, and this kind of gets us at the idea of brings in the idea of informational influence a little bit, informational social influence. So now it may be functional under certain circumstances to actually conform more when the task is really, really difficult, because you have a greater need for information. Okay, you have a greater need to listen to what others are saying because it's a difficult and highly ambiguous task. Okay? So here's a study done basically that involved people's conformity to memory judgments. Okay, like a lineup judgments of people that asking if they recognize a person as in a, for example, a police lineup. Okay, so what these researchers did, okay, was they did this study in which people are first told, "Hey, you know, this is a what we're giving you is a test of eyewitness memory ability." Okay, and you're going to go through various trials. And this is a very well developed test. Okay, it's got a lot of validity. Okay, and other people were told that we're just developing this test. It's not so important, really, and we're just basically norming it right now, and that's what you're going to be doing. And people are also told in the high importance condition that we're going to actually be given a gift. Okay, you're going to of being put in a lottery for a for a substantial sum of money. Okay, and every basically are the people who perform the best. Okay, on this are going to get greater and significantly more entries into this lottery. Okay. And the lottery was for something really valuable. Okay, so it was important. Other people were not told that, the low importance people. So for the high importance people, it's a valid test. It measures an ability of yours, and if you do well on it, you're going to get a reward. Okay, low importance, we're just norming this test. Okay, nothing much about getting a reward. Okay, and then people are presented with a bunch of trials in which they're first presented with briefly presented with a scene in which an individual appears. Okay, and then after that they're given a lineup of four individuals. Which one is the guy that you just saw? Okay, and there are four individuals giving responses, three of whom are Confederates. Okay, and the Confederates either you give the right answer most of the time, but on seven trials, okay, the Confederates who answer first, okay, identify the wrong person. Okay, so to what extent will people go along with the Confederates? Okay, the unanimous majority that said, okay, that's the guy. Okay, and they're wrong. Okay. Now, in the low importance condition, I need to add, the task is either really, really difficult, okay, they're only briefly for a couple of seconds presented with the stimulus, and they have only a couple of seconds to make their response, okay. In the easy task, they have more time to look at the stimulus, and they have more time to make an identification, okay. So if it's not important, okay, it's a trivial kind of task to people, we don't see that task difficulty has much of an impact, okay? And we get a certain level of conformity. So on 7 conformity trials, 2.5 or so conformity responses on average, okay? What about in the high importance condition? Well, you can see as importance goes up, okay, we see in the case of an easy task, okay, we see that, well, and the more important it is, the more people are likely to reject what the Confederates said, okay? They don't conform, okay? That makes a lot of sense. The more important it is, the less you're going to rely on others to make for your judgment, if it's an easy judgment. But if it's a difficult judgment, okay, we see that making it important, okay, increases conformity, right? Okay, we see greater conformity, okay, and the most conformity when it's a difficult task and it's a highly important decision you have to make. And that really illustrates informational social influence. It's a hard task, Okay, so there's lots of ambiguity. It's not easy to do. It makes sense to conform more because you need the information, okay, that others can provide. Okay, now the information is wrong, but it's a difficult task and that's not clear. So we rely, if it's a very, very important task, we may conform even more, okay, than if it's a very trivial task. Okay, an interesting kind of somewhat counterintuitive finding. So study this interaction between difficulty and importance and its role conformity. Okay, let me go through this quickly. Conformity increases with group size only up to a point. Okay, so basically, if we do the ASH study, you get to about 4, okay, 4 or 5, and if you increase the number of incorrect responses in that unanimous majority, beyond that, you don't get much more conformity, okay. What really matters is not the actual number of others, but one's perception of how many distinct others, independent thinkers, okay, there are. So 2 groups of 3 are more influential than 1 group of 6. Okay, we've talked about this, okay, when there was an ally and, you know, a deviant ally in Ash's study, conformity dropped precipitously, okay. Okay. Why does having an ally reduce majority influence on our behavior? Okay. Well, it's harder to stand alone, okay, than it is to have some social support, be a part of even a tiny minority. Okay. Social support is valuable. That gets us to a couple of things. First of all, normative influence, you know, the fear of rejection, the need for acceptance. Well, you've got an ally, okay. You can reject what the majority is saying, okay. Also, having someone who either agrees with you or doesn't agree with the majority in some other way, okay, suggests that, you know, maybe the information provided by that majority isn't necessarily so valid. Okay, so you got an informational influence factor going on there. Okay, so, but in general, any dissent can reduce the normative pressures to conform. Okay, note the legal decisions over a number of years now on whether or not 6-person juries are appropriate. Okay. And give just as valid kinds of verdicts as a 12-person jury. Okay, well, what becomes important here is the role of social support, if you will. Okay, so the argument had been, well, if you have a situation in which there's a 12-person jury, you know, of a 6-person jury, and 5 of them favor, say, guilty, and 1 favors acquittal, okay, of the jurors, okay, that should be equivalent to like a 12-person jury. That if we you know, if this jury is representative of the community, then we should have had 10 preferring guilt and 2 preferring acquittal. Okay, but is 5 versus 1 the same as 10 versus 2? Well, if we and that was assumed in some courts to be the case, but actually it's not true. Okay, we know from the research that having some social support has a tremendous effect in being able to resist a majority, to resist the powerful influence of a majority. Okay, 5 versus 1, you're standing by yourself if you're the one favoring acquittal. You've got no social support. Okay, if it's 10 versus 2, and you're one of the 2, well, you've got an ally. You've got social support. and that has a tremendous impact, okay, in how you're going to respond to the majority, okay. Of course, the other issue with the 6 versus 12 question has been, can you get as 6 is it going to give you as representative a sample of the community as 12? Okay. For our purposes, this 5 versus 1 and 10 versus 2 distinction and the role of social support is the crucial factor. Okay, 6-person juries are not as fair, okay, as 12-person juries. They don't give the minority the opportunity that a 12-person jury would. Okay, well, that's it for now. Now, you should note that the portion of this lecture on conformity has been about the influence of majorities. Sometimes people who are in the minority in a group can actually have influence and sway the majority. So it's the flip of conformity, okay? It's minority influence. You should read about minority influence in your textbook. Okay, well, goodbye for now.